Okay, we are going to talk about the importance of actually using our villains in Dungeons & Dragons, because the fact of the matter is I have seen plenty of games, played in plenty of games, and unfortunately ran a few games where the Dungeon Master has completely forgotten to use their villain. And then the players get to or near the final showdown of the campaign, and they meet the villain, and they're like, wait a second, who is this guy? What did this guy do? Is this guy evil? Should we like this guy? And having our players question if, I don't know, Leon the cat kicker is really evil or not really makes for kind of a damp climactic moment. And I don't want damp climactic moments. I want nice, crisp climactic moments. I guess you could say I like my climactic moments like I like my rat boyfriends. Not damp, nice and crisp. I'm online too much. I'm too much online. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Wes, isn't using villains kind of intuitive, right? Like, that's like making a delicious pasta primavera and then forgetting to eat it, right? But let me tell you what, later we're going to talk about some multi-million-dollar franchises that forgot to eat that pasta primavera and ended up being ridiculed for years online. And if they can let that saucy pasta slip through their fingers, let me tell you something, so can we. Also, for those of you too hungry to follow along, the pasta in this metaphor is the villain. But how do we make sure we don't forget that villain? How do we make sure that the players know about the villain, know that the villain is evil, and want to defeat him? People sometimes have this kind of gut reaction to this question where they're like, oh, well, the quest giver tells them. The quest giver informs the players of the villain's evil actions or plot, and then that's how they know how the villain is evil. That's how they know that the villain is bad, right? That's what makes them want to defeat the villain. But this breaks one of the core tenets of writing, which you might remember from the English teacher whose room you ate lunch in, and that is showing and not telling. And yeah, I get it. Sometimes you need a little exposition. Sometimes you need to tell the players what's going on, but for the most part, I feel like this is a pretty good rule that makes things more personal for our players and helps them get to know the villain and form that relationship of conflict. Yeah, that relationship of conflict, that makes sense. It's not just some peasant telling them, like, oh, sirs, my village burnt down. It's the players being shown the village while the village is burning down, like seeing the ashes, feeling the fire on their face, right? They're being shown the eviliness of the villain, something that just relying on our NPCs informing the players doesn't do as well. Like rumors, lore dumps, common knowledge of the people can all be really powerful. These individuals who are telling the players like, there is a darkness in the land that has awoken once again, right? They can act to foreshadow the villain, foreshadow what's to come, to inform the players, set the mood. But these are more supplementary tools in the grand scheme of things, and if the villain isn't directly interacting with the players in some way, these tools are going to be a lot less effective. These tools of telling the players directly, right? We need some method of hero-villain interaction where the villain is directly antagonizing the players. Let me give you an example of some fiction that does this really well. In The Lord of the Rings, pretty quickly after we learn about Sauron, right? After we are told rumors and lore, the Ringwraiths pull up and we get to see them as they begin to act in Sauron's stead. We see them continually directly antagonize the hobbits on their way to Rivendell, and almost as importantly, it is made very clear that the Ringwraiths are directly acting in accordance with Sauron's wishes because he is the main villain of the series. The Ringwraiths show up throughout the books and movies to show that Sauron, the villain, is there, right? The villain is present in the world. The villain is acting in the world. Having the villain directly antagonize the players is a very integral part to whether or not your players will feel like they are being antagonized and feel like that villain is a villain. If this wasn't the case, if the villain was forgotten about or otherwise left unused, everyone would get to the end of the story and there'd be some like really awkward line, probably like I don't know, like this.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
And that can feel really jarring and confusing when a villain shows up seemingly randomly after having benched for an unusual length of time or not shown at all, right? And for players who have been making it their sole mission to stop something in the world or galaxy for the last few weeks or months or 9 movies spanning 42 years, a little annoying. right? We need to not only foreshadow the villain to come, but also make sure that that villain is spreading their tendrils into the world, threatening the world, and more importantly than threatening the world, this might come as a shock to some, right? Threatening the players. Because the players are who we see the world through, right? We see the world through their eyes. Their eyes are certainly the eyes they see the world through, right? And that's what I'm talking about when I say you have to remember to use your villain. You have to let that villain be a villain. Let that antagonist be antagonistic, like turning people into pigs indiscriminately or whatever your villain is doing, right? They cannot just be sidelined like waiting for the final showdown. They cannot just say hi in the beginning. They have to be acting in the world and acting against your players, directly antagonizing your players. And you have to remember that the world and your players are kind of two different things, right? Like sometimes I see dungeon masters who they remember to threaten the world. They remember that the world is being affected by an evil entity, but then they forget that everything in the world is, like I said, being viewed through the eyes of the players. And so the antagonizations of the villain are there, but the direct antagonizations towards the players are not. And so the players don't feel the evil in the world. They don't feel excited to face that villain. Star Wars is actually a great example of this as well. We can see in the sequels that the Empire is back. The Empire is having an effect on people and doing all their dark Empire stuff, right? But it feels totally separate from Palpatine because he's not there to be the antagonist, right? It doesn't feel like he is doing anything until he just suddenly pops in at the end. Like in the original trilogy, when they are destroying planets, Darth Vader is like, "Hey, Princess Leia, I noticed you're the main character. I'm here acting in Palpatine's stead, the main villain, to commit an atrocity that directly affects you." Right? It's direct. It's a direct antagonization. It includes the main villain. It includes the villain's lieutenant, right, acting in his stead. It includes a main character directly being affected, directly being antagonized. But in the sequels, when they're destroying planets, they're like, "Ah, yes, we will destroy these planets to stop the chaos that we manufactured." Right? And that's like, it's a bit damp rat boyfriend, if you ask me, right? It doesn't feel relevant to the people whose eyes we are viewing the story through. It doesn't feel relevant to the main characters. Like, they see it and react, but it doesn't really feel like a direct assault against them, a direct antagonization against them. And in Dungeons & Dragons, I see a few different reasons for why Dungeon Masters forget to use their main villain. In Star Wars, it was likely because of how disjointed the writers were across the movies, right? But in D&D, it's just us. It's just the Dungeon Master. There's one of us, right? So that probably won't happen to us. So what is happening when villains are accidentally sidelined in D&D? Well, one of the biggest things I see is that Dungeon Masters will want that big reveal at the end of the campaign, but they don't know how to create a figure that the evils of the campaign are being attributed to. Like in a standard mystery, you have a clear idea of what has been done, right? Like someone has been murdered, and then it is made clear that someone else is responsible, right? It's kind of like you can see the outline of the Pokemon before it's guessed. The reader is given a clear mental picture of the villain's actions despite the villain not being known until the reveal that happens before the climax, so that there's a rush to action, right? But what I sometimes see in D&D games is that players don't really know who they're looking for. Like, they don't know what to attribute in the world to this figure. And then when that person is revealed, it's just done way too late, so that there's no like rush to action, no urgency, right? The second biggest thing I see, and something that I was definitely guilty of as a young dungeon master, is that the Dungeons & Dragons books, like the Monster Manual and the Dungeon Master's Guide, are filled with exciting stuff that you want to use, that you want to have your players face. But sometimes it can be kind of a distraction from what's happening in your world as you're trying to fit all of these creatures into your game. It can sometimes push the main antagonist out. So you have to remember to like keep that villain there, make them responsible for these creatures, right? Make sure it is the villain who is really the one directly antagonizing your players, and that they aren't just like getting a random loot box of monsters every session. But that said, direct antagonization doesn't mean you need to imprison your players and destroy their planets in front of them, right? Or have your level 30 shadow warlords smack them around town. This early level beat up is something that I often see recommended to help your players get to know your villain, probably because it's used pretty extensively in fiction, but it's something of which I personally am just not a fan, and I will tell you why. For me, this method of having the villain smack the players around during the first session often feels more like you are playing through a scene rather than playing a game in a world where choices and decisions matter and have an effect on the outcomes. Right? If a villain shows up and you have an outcome already planned, it takes away from the agency of the players. Like, what they do in that encounter no longer matters. In fact, while I think that antagonists should be antagonistic, should antagonize the players, I don't think that means they have to be there in the flesh to do so. Do they? If we go back to Lord of the Rings for a second, we never see Sauron, right? At least not in the flesh. And that adds a lot to that feeling of omnipresence he has across the lands, where his influence can be felt, can be directly felt by Frodo and Sam and Aragorn and every single person fighting for the good of the realm. They feel directly attacked by him, even though he was not directly there. But how do you strike that balance? How do you make sure that our villain is there, is being evil, right, without making our players feel hopeless? Well, I know I keep going back to Lord of the Rings, but Lord of the Rings uses a bunch of methods in order to do this that all work really well. We talked about having the villain's thralls or followers act in the villain's stead, right, to directly antagonize the main characters or players. That's one way that works really well. We also talked about making sure that the players know whose stead those followers are acting in, right? Because if they don't know who they are being attacked by, they aren't really going to make that association. But something else Lord of the Rings does is that it makes extensive use of more clairvoyant imagery, and this is something we see a lot of in the fantasy genre. This is seen when Sauron's eye almost climbs over the mountains to directly gaze upon Frodo when he puts on the ring. It's seen when Pippin picks up Saruman's orb and Sauron begins speaking into his mind, and it's seen when Frodo gazes into the mirror of Galadriel. Sauron is constantly watching Frodo from afar, looking for the ring, right? Reacting to the new knowledge and almost getting into the main characters' minds. If not figuratively, then literally. And this is very effective because these dreams and visions can go both ways and are a great way to show your villain, but also have your villain antagonize your players a bit. Something I did in my own game was give my players a circlet of dreaming, right? That allowed them to attempt to scry a creature's whereabouts in their dreams, but if they failed the roll, that creature would instead gaze upon them, right? A bit of cat and mouse with the heroes where they are able to gather some information, but also potentially be directly antagonized by the villain if the villain were to find their whereabouts through this circlet. Lord of the Rings, and also the Black Cauldron, if you watch that video, also uses this awakening of evil in the world, right? Of the evil, like, slowly awakening. Most of the evil in The Lord of the Rings that the main characters interact with is in some way directly tied back to Sauron. In the books, the Barrow-wights are awoken by the head ringwraith, right? The Witch King Angmar, who serves Sauron. The orcs were, quote, elves once, taken by the dark powers, and the Haradrim journey north to directly serve Sauron. Almost everyone they fight are directly related to Sauron's quest for power or serving him in some way or another, or maybe are just affected by his boss's evil, I guess, in this case. All this to say, you can use multiple avenues to have your villain directly antagonize your players and be that villain in your world. And you can get creative with it, right? Recently, I was watching the Prestige of all movies, which isn't really fantasy. Is it fantasy? It's kind of fantasy, right? It's about magicians, right? The layman's wizard. But in that movie, it's a story about like two magicians whose rivalry slowly becomes more and more deadly, right? There's more to it than that, but it got me thinking like, man, it would be really cool to have a game where the players are having like a more competitive rivalry with another adventuring group, and then that rivalry, if I can say the word rivalry, slowly becomes more and more serious until like blood must be shed and the other group of adventurers slowly becomes more and more evil. Or maybe our players become more and more evil, right? Anyways, I know there's a little bit more to that movie, but it does do the cat and mouse game very well. And it shows us that we can break out of more traditional methods while just making sure to use our villain. We just need to remember to directly antagonize our players in some way while letting them win and finding some sense of progress in the world, right? Let that villain grow organically over time, affect the world, let the players get excited to face that villain, right, without fear of like maybe being destined to lose, and allow some sort of interaction between the villain and the players that could be through dreams, it could be through the villain affecting some friends of theirs, right? Or it could be through the players witnessing the villain's slow descent into evil. Oh my god, are you using your wizard eyes on me? He's using his wizard eyes. Anyways, I'm clearly late for a playdate with my dog, so I have to go. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Wes. This guy's name is Prismo, and this is Tabletop Writer, where I look at methods of writing through the lens of tabletop gaming. Enjoy the blooper. See you next time. Is that it makes extensive use of oh my Lord of the Rings.